Our last presenter today is Jessica Rutkoski. She is a small grains breeder and a quantitative geneticist. Jessica currently leads the winter wheat breeding program at the University of Illinois at Urbana Champaign. Her mission is to develop wheat varieties that will help enhance farm profitability in Illinois as well as surrounding states. In line with this goal, Jessica's scholarly research program develops and implements new ways to make plant breeding and variety evaluation more effective with the help of technologies like remote sensing and genomics. Before joining the University of Illinois, Jessica completed her PhD in plant breeding at Cornell University and worked internationally for 5 years supporting plant breeding programs in less developed countries. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rutkoski.
Hello. Thanks everyone for watching this presentation, staying till the end here. This is my first time at a Soybean Association sponsored event, so it's really exciting to get to know a new crowd of people. And today I'm talking about wheat genetics and management considerations for double crop soybean success. First, I'm going to introduce myself a little bit since I am new here. I started at the University of Illinois as an assistant professor and a small grains breeder in 2019. But I've been working on small grains breeding since 2009 when I started my doctoral degree at Cornell, started working on wheat breeding. Here in this picture is my research group. These are the graduate students and staff that work with me on small grains breeding. About 2/3 of the people here are under my supervision working on wheat breeding specifically, and the other third works on other small grains like oats and triticale and other research that focuses in that area. And my goal since I joined at the University of Illinois is to improve wheat for the wheat double crop soybean system. But I think this work has actually really been going on for a long time, even before I joined. My predecessor, the previous wheat breeder, Dr. Fred Kolb, had been doing this work, had been breeding wheat and keeping the double crop soybean system in mind in that process. And then even before him, there was another breeder. So just to give you perspective, we're standing in front of our building where we operate out of. That brick building in the background has been there since 1930s, so we've been around and doing this work for actually a really long time, even though probably a lot of people don't realize it or never really knew that the U of I was working in this area. So I like to kind of get the word out that we are, a lot of us working on this, and we've been doing it for a long time. And why am I here at a meeting talking about soybeans and double cropping, and what's the importance for us here in the state of Illinois? Well, it's actually really interesting that we're actually in the top 2 states for wheat double crop soybean acres in the United States. It's between Illinois and North Carolina. And I think North Carolina has always been number 1, but I think those numbers are kind of changing, and I would probably guess that last year we might have been number 1 based on the number of acres and wheat acres being increased in the state. Illinois is also the largest wheat producer in the eastern U.S., so east of the Mississippi, and also if you also include Missouri, we're number 1 in terms of wheat production in that entire region. And then if you look at the entire U.S., we're 10th overall. So people don't really realize how much wheat is being produced here and how important of a state we are for wheat production, but we really are pretty important in the grand scheme of things. Acreage, although it pales in comparison to corn and soybeans, on average over the past 5 years, the acreage has been 620,000 wheat acres, and 80% of those are with double crop soybeans. So important for the state, important for the country, and yet, people don't often realize that. And I think there's a lot of benefits to keeping wheat in the rotation. We touched on this earlier today, talking about the benefits of crop rotation generally for controlling weeds and diseases. But including wheat in the rotation also provides benefits to the soil, so we can help reduce soil erosion. Going back to the other benefits like suppressing soybean cyst nematode populations, there's research has shown that wheat can help do that. Offering some weed control options, just by including wheat in the rotation. But the last thing I want to highlight and talk about more is the potential to enhance profitability. Because if we can't enhance profitability, all these other bullet points are not going to be, we're not going to see the benefits of those. We have to be able to have, greater profit from growing wheat and including wheat in the rotation if we want to see these other benefits and make sure that wheat double crop soybeans is economically viable. So if we look at over the past few years, this is data on profitability of wheat double crop soybeans on average in southern Illinois. So this graph shows the return for wheat double crop soybeans relative to just soybeans. So you can see that there's some years where wheat double crop soybeans is more profitable than just soybeans alone, and some years it's less profitable on average. But if you look at it overall, so more often than not, the wheat double crop soybean return is greater than just soybean alone. But there's obviously a lot of room to grow here because you can see this bounces around depending on the year. So I would like to see this a little bit better. We want to improve this aspect and make sure that we can get more consistent returns and see a greater advantage from this system than what we currently do see. I also want to point out that these are averages, so there are a lot of people that are doing much better than this, and there's some people that may be achieving less success depending on what the yields were in those fields. So a lot of room for improvement and a lot of variation in success and profitability from double crop soybeans. So I want to focus on profitability, and as a wheat breeder, I think a lot about wheat, obviously. I spent a lot of time looking at wheat and wheat genetics. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is from that point of view. But I think it's important to consider the whole system when making decisions. So it's not just a matter of trying to maximize yield of wheat and trying to maximize yield of the double crop soybeans, but considering the whole system when making decisions. And so I'm going to be discussing what can be done on the wheat side to improve the system. But not to say that, because I'm not talking about the double crop soybean side in this presentation, not to say that that's not important, because obviously it is. We have to think of the whole system. But I'll be focusing in on the wheat side and giving some ideas based on sort of my observations and what I know about wheat and wheat genetics. Okay, so let's try to untangle profitability. What are the drivers, or what are the levers that we can pull to manipulate this? And it's pretty easy to figure out what these levers are. So profit is just the wheat yield by the wheat price plus the double crop soybean yield times the soybean price, and then all that minus the production cost. So that's looks simple when you can just write that formula there. Of course, it's a lot more difficult to actually manipulate these in practice because we know that there's a lot that's not under our control. The yields, not everything is always under our control. Prices are not always under our control, although there are things that we can control. And I hope I can give you some pointers, especially on the wheat side, on how do we improve the wheat yield, how do we improve the wheat price, how do we improve the double crop soybean yield. On the wheat side, there are basically three things that I think are most critical. There's a lot of other factors that can be considered, but probably the three biggest ones that are the most important would be harvesting early, and there are different ways to achieve that. We'll get into that. Controlling scab and improving yield. So although and still a lot to unpack there, right? Still a lot to discuss in each one of those. But if you can just think of those three things when you're thinking about the wheat side of things: harvesting early, controlling scab, and improving yield. So then the question is how and why? What's the importance of these, and then how? All right, so earlier wheat harvest gives us higher soybean yields if we can plant the double crop soybeans earlier, right? So if we can plant 2 days earlier, we can get 1 bushel per acre more, greater yield on the double crop soybeans. So if you put that into perspective in terms of dollars, if you think about the price per bushel of soybeans, 2 days delayed planting after harvesting wheat, or right around that time when you're planting double crop soybeans, every 2 days is worth $13 per acre. So just think about that. Think of that when you put that into perspective. And so that's the value of being able to plant earlier. Every 2 days, you can gain a bushel, and that bushel's worth $13 per acre, or whatever the market price is at the time. Okay, talking about how to harvest earlier. 3 options, basically. Number 1, harvest wheat at a higher percent moisture and dry the grain. So that is great for many reasons. You can help preserve the quality, so you won't be worried about losing test weight by having the grain sit in the field to get rained on. Also, there's no real yield penalty to that. So you harvest at a higher moisture and dry, you will not penalize yield. You will perhaps improve test weight potentially, but there is a cost associated with that. There's a drying cost. So there's pros and cons to that. But relatively easy to implement if you have access to that ability to dry the grain. The other option would be to plant earlier, but still after the fly-free date. So we know in wheat there's the Hessian fly-free date that we all are supposed to plant after that particular date, and that is still important because we don't want to have issues with Hessian fly. We've probably never seen it here in the state, but if everybody starts planting at the earlier and earlier, there's potential we could see this, and we don't want to have problems with this disease. And my colleagues in other states have to deal with this, and I definitely don't want to have to deal with it here in Illinois. It's not something that will be something that we want to add to our list of problems. So we still want to look for that fly-free date, plant afterwards, but on the earlier end of that time frame. So we want to be planting at the fly-free date, or 2 weeks after is considered optimal. So planting earlier will get you a little bit earlier, like heading and maturity in the wheat crop, but there is a relatively small effect that you can really take advantage of there. So that'll get you, maybe get you a couple days, but there is not a whole lot of room to push the wheat earlier by manipulating the planting date. So there's not too much leeway there, but there is an effect, that can contribute. On the other bullet point, which I'll get into more details on, is selecting earlier wheat varieties. So there's a lot of pluses and minuses there. So earlier wheat varieties, obviously really easy to implement. You can just select an earlier variety, when you're making your variety selection decisions, and then that could get you, potentially 4 or 5 days, depending on how early that variety is relative to what you're already growing. So there's potential to gain those extra days. But there are some challenges with that. So number 1, there's going to be a greater risk of freeze damage. This picture here, Maybe you're familiar with this and you've seen it before. This is a wheat spike with visible freeze damage at harvest, where you can see what happened was sterility. So there was, in the head, usually towards the tip of the spike, there will be no grain fill in those spikelets. It can also happen different, it doesn't have to be the tip of the spike. It can happen on different parts of the spike. That is a visible sign of freeze damage, and sometimes it can be really severe. Sometimes you can have a lot of sterility. And I see this practically every year in some, one field or another, in one variety or another. So it does happen a lot more than I think we realize. Now, another thing is, sometimes you don't see the symptoms as obvious as this. Sometimes depending on what stage of growth the plant was in, when there was a cold snap in the spring, you will see different kinds of effects. So sometimes it might just affect the size of the head, or maybe kill tillers, so the damage may not be clearly visible, but it may still be there. Whereas if there wasn't that cold snap, you might have had higher yields. So that is a challenge with the early varieties. They're likely to head earlier, so they will be, if there happens to be a cold snap in the spring, they're going to have that vulnerable time period coinciding with those colder temperatures. The other challenge that we have with trying to select early varieties and weigh that the earliness with the yield and try to make decisions is that we have really imprecise and subjective information on maturity groups. You can look at seed catalogs, and they'll give some level, right? They'll say early, very early, medium early, ultra early, and that's really pretty subjective. The seed company has their way of doing it, but then another seed company will have maybe a very different way of trying to assess that. And so if you're looking across companies, what one company says is very early, another company might call that medium early or early, right? So it's difficult to compare, and it's pretty imprecise. It doesn't tell you, how many days earlier is it, compared to a specific variety. So it doesn't give you the maturity date or the date that you'd be harvesting in terms of days. It just gives you a sort of a subjective category. So it's difficult to assess. The other challenge is that early varieties, especially thinking about biology and just how plants produce yield, they have generally lower yield potential because they have less time to put on biomass, and then that's less nutrients available to later fill the grain. So these are all the challenges that we have to try to work with. But there's a lot of progress being made on all these fronts. So in spite of these challenges, still we can use this as a tool. We can still use early wheat varieties, and we can work with this and try to improve and address these challenges. And that's what a lot of the work I do, in my breeding program and my research. We're trying to address these specific challenges to make early wheat varieties something that is more easy to use and you can get more benefits out of it. So just to show you what is the progress in this area. So right here on the slide is a graph showing the genetic progress in yield in the University of Illinois breeding program. And this is for the past 20 years. And so over the past 20 years, we've made a half a bushel increase in yield per year just due to genetic improvement. And this has not affected the days to maturity. So we've actually controlled that days to maturity and improved yield. What that means is that early varieties are getting better. All maturity classes are getting better. We're getting that same consistent improvement regardless of the maturity class. So the early varieties, all varieties of today are better than the varieties of yesterday, and that includes our early varieties as well. And just to acknowledge, one of my graduate students is the one, Lucas Munaro, is the one who conducted this analysis, looking at 20 years of data and analyzing and dissecting the environment from the genetic trends to really get to this number of half a bushel per acre increase per year. And our breeding program is one of many in the eastern region. So there's obviously private companies that are involved in breeding wheat, and they are probably achieving even greater success than we are. So I would say that a half a bushel per acre increase per year is probably a conservative estimate in the industry as a whole. I would say we're probably, other breeding programs may be even better than this. Now, another thing that we're working on is to better evaluate maturity groups. So we have started a project where we're going to be looking at all the varieties in the state variety trial. So these are wheat varieties submitted from different companies. There's probably around 100 varieties of wheat, and we're looking at assessing more precisely their maturity and looking not only at their maturity, like the date that they reach that particular crop stage, but we're looking at the date when they reach a specific moisture level. So we're going to be determining when do they reach 14% moisture and actually quantifying that time, because that's really the most critical value for determining when you're going to be able to plant the double crop soybeans and what's the advantage on the subsequent crop. So that's something that we just started. We have the trials in the ground now, and this summer we'll be collecting data for the first time and publishing that in the state variety trial report. We've also started a project on assessing the spring freeze risk in wheat varieties, in those same wheat varieties in the state variety trial. And what we're going to do is determine when those varieties break dormancy in the spring. Because wheat goes into dormancy in the winter, and then when it decides to wake up and start growing, that is at the point in time where it becomes more vulnerable to cold. So the idea is if we can identify varieties that stay dormant a little bit longer, they will be able to not be subject to those damaging temperatures. So we will be assessing this and then determining the spring freeze risk on every variety. So ideally, what you should be able to find when you look at the variety trial data is you'll have the spring freeze risk, the date that varieties reach 14% moisture, and their yield in multiple environments. And with that kind of data, now it becomes a little bit easier to determine what is the best, what's the best variety, and weigh those different traits against each other to really determine what would be the best variety for a double crop soybean system. Okay. So going on to the next major, it's like action item, that one of the most important things to make sure that wheat is profitable, regardless of double crop soybeans or not, is to control scab. We just heard a lot about soybean diseases, and I feel a little bit fortunate that I think, although we do have a lot of diseases, scab is really the number one thing that we have to worry about, and all the other diseases are, although they are somewhat important, they're less of a concern, definitely. So scab is number one. It's the one that, if you just focus on controlling scab, you will be in really good shape. So I think it's less complicated in a lot of ways in wheat, and that, we don't have a ton of other really damaging diseases. Scab is the most economically damaging one, and it still is. It has been for a long time. So what is wheat head scab? Well, it is a disease that causes the symptoms I'm showing you here. So there's symptoms on grains as well as on spikes. So if you walk into the field, you can sometimes see these symptoms it's a couple weeks after flowering. it's usually can be kind of hard to see these symptoms because right after the symptoms become visible, you start to get senescence happening. So the time frame when you can actually see the symptoms is pretty short. So you may have this in the field and you don't even notice. Now the other thing is sometimes you don't even have the visual symptoms on the spikes, but you still have damage on the grain. And that actually happened this past year across multiple states. There were many cases where there was absolutely no visual symptoms and everyone saw, oh, there's zero scab, and then you look at the grain and there was actually damage and vomitoxin. And so the grain damage is really what we are most concerned about because that is affecting the value of the grain. And what the pathogen does is it produces a toxin called vomitoxin, which is also, scientific name is deoxynivalenol, or DON. And that is what the pathogen uses to infect. So it is using this toxin to get in to the plant, and it is actually producing the toxin, and that's accumulating in the grains. You can probably see in the picture, there's these white bleached grains, and those are gonna have a lot of vomitoxin. Some of the grains that look healthy may also have vomitoxin. So it's a tricky disease, and it's, it can be really damaging because there's a lot of penalties, there's a lot of discounts that are applied, when the grain is looking as bad as this, especially, and even when it has some vomitoxin. So just looking at this now, putting into more precise numbers or values on what the importance of vomitoxin, and also to mention that scab affects test weight as well. So it will also reduce test weight and it will also produce vomitoxin. This is kind of a double whammy when it comes to reducing grain quality. So here on this is just a graph. I took some data from a bunch of different grain elevators and looked at the discount schedules and averaged them and come up with a general pattern of, what's the general discount for vomitoxin and test weight in terms of dollars per bushel. Basically, you lose $0.25, 25 cents per bushel for every 1 part per million increase in vomitoxin beyond 2 parts per million. So there's a lot of variation depending on where you're going to sell the grain to, but that's on average. And you basically have a kind of a 2 parts per million grace period. Beyond that, you start to get into some pretty heavy discounts. With test weight, it's roughly similar, about 25 cents 25 cents per bushel every 1 pound decrease in test weight beyond 56 pounds per bushel. So you have between 58 is the target, and then there's some slight discounting that can occur if it's less than 58, but really once you start getting 56 and below, then you start to get into some heavy discounts. So if you have a bad issue with scab, or even an average scab year, if you just, let's say you didn't try to control it, and conditions were just typically favorable for scab, as it is here, very common here in Illinois, you would probably see discounts. So it's not that difficult to start to get into issues with vomitoxin. The past couple of years has been really low scab years. It's been fantastic, but that's not typical. Typically Illinois has very, very favorable conditions for scab. Also, with minimal tillage, that also makes scab a lot more risk. There's a higher risk of getting scab, and so this is not going away. Now, the one advantage that we have compared to a lot of other diseases is that we don't really see much change in the pathogen. It's not really evolving to overcome the resistance that we have built through breeding. So that is one, a silver lining with this pathogen. So controlling scab, basically 2 things that we can do: select varieties that are at least moderately resistant, and spray an effective fungicide at flowering. And I'd say both are really needed for the best control. So they have an additive effect. If you, so let's say your level of scab is here. If you spray, you can bring that down. If you have a resistant variety, you can bring that down further. So it's not that, oh, I've sprayed, now I don't need resistance. That's not the right way to approach it. You can spray and still get plenty of scab. Or you can have a moderately resistant variety that's not sprayed, still get plenty of scab. But when you put two together, you can really get good control. And so that is what we recommend. Now, when it comes to choosing scab-resistant varieties, there's some things to keep in mind. So no varieties are immune. That's why we still recommend spraying a fungicide. Because no varieties are immune, we shy away from calling varieties resistant because we don't want to send the message that, oh, this is resistant, so I don't need to worry about it. So typically we'll give them a moderately resistant rating and consider that a very good level of scab resistant. In rare cases, we may call a variety resistant if it really is, an outlier and having very high levels of resistance, but still, there's no immunity. And all the varieties that are entered in the official state variety trial are evaluated for scab, and we evaluate in a misted and inoculated trial. We take the grain samples and look at grain quality, and we also get the vomitoxin on every single sample. So the data that we publish is based on the vomitoxin, not just how nice it looked in the field, but really the vomitoxin level. And if you look at this website here where the QR code is pointing you to, you can get all those results on those varieties and get a nice objective evaluation of all the varieties that are available. And I really liked how Jason Bond put up some information that seed companies provide, and it made me remember to tell you that the information that seed companies provide is useful, and the companies, they do know a lot about the products they sell, but it's difficult sometimes to know what exactly they're considering as resistant or moderately resistant. Sometimes when I look at the catalogs, I'm like, well, everything is good. That's impossible. Not everything is good. So you have to be a little bit critical and dig in and look at these data, because not everything is excellent. It's just keep that in mind. You want to look at this data and decide for yourself. So although I said not everything is excellent, there are a lot of excellent varieties out there. So make sure you take a look at the information and see what level of resistance maybe your variety has, or use that to help you guide decision making, because there are a lot of good options and a lot more now than there ever has been. And just like I showed you about trends in yield due to breeding, we see similar success in scab resistance. So here, this is a graph showing improvements in resistance to scab over time. This is the level of vomitoxin in parts per million over the past 20 years. This is just due to breeding, so controlling for any change in environment. And we're seeing a 0.1 parts per million reduction in vomitoxin per year just based on the genetics. So it's kind of a slow improvement, but it's steady. So if we just continue to keep going in this direction, and the pathogen luckily is not rapidly evolving so far. Hopefully it stays that way. So we will hopefully get to the point where more and more of the varieties available are resistant or very resistant. And scab-resistant varieties are better now than they ever have been. So if you've ever had experience before and didn't like what was available in terms of scab resistance, it's worth taking a second look, because there's a lot of improvements that have been made. Okay, and fungicides, it's important to mention because we do need both. The three that are recommended are Miravis Ace, Prosaro, and Caramba. Miravis Ace is the most probably the most popular one now, one of the newer chemicals that provides really good control. But all three of these are good, so these are all recommended. The timing is really critical, and that can be really difficult to achieve because not every single plant in a field is at the exact same developmental stage. So, controlling scab and applying fungicide at this optimal timing, which is at anthesis, that can be difficult. But you have to try the best you can to get that timing at early anthesis. So that's why I put this red box here. That's when the anthers just start to shed. So you should see very early anthesis. If it's to the point where you see anthers and they're white, it's a little bit too late, but you really want to be trying to get it at that point. There is some data from, I think, Syngenta that shows that Moravis Ace is effective in a longer window of time for application. And that is true to some extent. There is, I think, I can't remember if it's like you can spray it a little bit earlier or a little bit later. That's what the company says. But when you look at data where people have tested this over many, many environments, they've shown that if you really want to achieve the best control, this is still the best application window, that right at early anthesis. So you still need to try to apply at this time, regardless of what new product says. Okay, this one can be applied later or earlier. Don't rely on that. That might help you if you're late or early for whatever reason, but you still want to be doing it at that early anthesis stage. Okay. So the last thing is, of course, improving yield. And, there's a lot that we could talk about there, and I'm just going to go through just a couple things that I think are important. There's a huge, number of things we could get into and probably spend an entire day on that. But number one, I think, nutrients recommended and at proper times. Oftentimes, I think that, if you see a field that doesn't look as good as it should be, I think a lot of times it has to do with the timing of the nitrogen in the spring. So we want to have nitrogen applied in the fall and at spring at that proper time, right at jointing, and that can be difficult to achieve, but that's really crucial. And fungicides and herbicides in the spring, narrow row spacing, so avoiding wider rows, staying with the 7.5-inch row spacing as opposed to 15 inches, which some people are trying out. It's still better to do narrower row spacing. Planting within 2 weeks of the fly-free date and not too much later than that. Once you start getting later, you start to get poorer stands, and that can impact the yield. Seeding rates, at least 1.2 million seeds per acre. That's the economic optimum for wheat, but some companies are recommending more than there may be some benefit to that, but 1.2 million is still kind of the recommended rate. And of course, commercial seed of the best varieties. You definitely want to be investing in that because it does pay off. And then timely harvest, getting that wheat out harvested as soon as possible, because of course that benefits not only the quality and the yield of the wheat crop, but also the double crop soybean yield to get those soybeans planted sooner. And again, when you want to select the best wheat varieties, we have this great resource that the University of Illinois provides, which is the official state variety trial. And the data is published every year, available on the website. And so that includes information on yield. The companies provide information on things like maturity group and some other characteristics, like if it's bearded, non-bearded, and all this other information. We also collect data on scab resistance and other traits like height, and we're adding to this now with the spring freeze risk and the day that they reach 14% moisture. And I encourage you to get and look at this information, and it can be a little bit daunting because it's there are pages and pages of tables, and that's something I hope to improve in the future, is make it a little bit more digestible. But I recommend just honing in, considering the traits: yield, scab resistance, maturity, and test weight. Just hone in on that. I think it helps to look at a variety you're familiar with and use that as a reference for comparison. So if there's something that you're familiar with, you've grown it already, look at that one and see, okay, what's better than this in terms of yield, or what's better than this in terms of scab resistance, and that's a good way to start. And then there's some value in also looking at previous year's data, not just the current year, because there is a large year effect. Things can change in rank across years, and so it's good to look at multiple years. And then keep in mind that not all varieties available are tested in that trial. So it's only a proportion of actually what's available. So if you don't see what's, some company or variety that you're interested in, it just may not be available, and that's, for whatever reason. That doesn't mean it's a bad variety. And then, just in general, if you want to, just generally, there's one thing you can remember from this talk is that newer varieties are going to be better than older ones on average. And so there's a lot of value in updating and staying up to date on the wheat genetics and switching to newer varieties. And, this is on average, of course. And then again, want to, reemphasize that we're going to be providing more information and making this, our variety trial data, more useful especially for wheat and double crop soybeans together. And that's why we are providing this data on when dormancy is being released. And we'll be summarizing that in the variety testing data. And then when the varieties reach 14% moisture. So that's thanks to funding by the Illinois Soybean Association that we're able to collect. This data is not really easy to collect, so that's why it hasn't been done in the past. And so this is gonna be the first year that we're even doing this, or probably anybody has done this. So we're kind of in uncharted territory, but I'm pretty excited because I like a challenge. I like to be able to try to measure things that people say is really hard to measure. So looking forward to be able to present these results in future meetings. So to summarize, just the key points here that decisions made for wheat influence profitability of the wheat double crop soybean system as a whole. You want to aim for earlier maturity, better scab control, and higher yield. So that's sometimes hard to achieve all those things at the same time, especially when there are trade-offs, but more data is useful to be able to try to weigh those against each other. And variety selection decisions are really key and something that I think is worth revisiting every year and spending time doing it. Last, I want to make an announcement to an upcoming event, which is the Illinois Wheat Association's Winter Double Crop Farmers Forum, which is right around here in Mount Vernon. And there'll be an entire day talking about different aspects of wheat management and focusing in on how do we make it better, how do we improve wheat double crop soybeans together. And then I'd like to acknowledge all the people and the people that, funding agencies that help support, what I do and our goals at the University of Illinois. So thank you, and I hope I can take questions. Oh, already, yeah.
Have you seen any correlation, like no-till wheat in the corn stalks versus no-till wheat in the bean stubble, it having higher disease pressure in that corn stalk environment?
Yeah, so that's something that is very well known, that if the more corn residue that is in the field on the surface, that's gonna be higher disease pressure for scab. Now, I've seen a lot of residue even in soybean. If you're following soybeans, you're still gonna potentially have a lot of corn residue. So, I tend to not be too concerned about, they recommend, okay, you're not supposed to plant wheat after corn, but I think in practice, I think that the scab is there. It's in the environment, it's in the atmosphere. it's really hard to avoid it. So I wouldn't, you know, I shouldn't recommend planting wheat after corn, but I don't think it's as big of a deal as we think it is.